Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of the Gray Matter X live stream. Now, we have a very exciting topic. We haven't done one of these live streams in a while. So we thought we'd come up with a really great topic and one that is of interest to really just about everyone. And that's individual rights and freedoms and civil liberties. And then bring in two very learned but very interesting guests who are both very, very intelligent, but have different perspectives on this topic, and see what kind of a conversation we can have. So I'm going to steer the conversation a little bit, do a lot of listening to these guys. I've had both of them had the pleasure of hosting them on my show. Our first guest is Professor Bruce Pardy, very distinguished legal scholar. I think one of the top minds and constitutional minds in Canadian constitutional law. Has been published widely and recently was on the Jordan Peterson podcast. So you've probably seen his face or read some of the stuff that he's done. Great to have him on the show. And Viva Frei, who is I guess we could call him a former lawyer, who was a lawyer in Montreal at a couple of big firms, and then emigrated to somewhere in the United States. I won't say particularly. Maybe he wants to say.
I'm in Florida, baby.
He's in Florida, and he has developed one of the most watched, one of the most followed, I would say, legal discussion platforms anywhere, and has, I believe, over 1 million followers now, and for good reason. It's a great show, very entertaining, very funny, and very interested in what's going on, not only in Canada, his home country, but also in the United States. He follows the whole Trump situation very, very closely. So I'm very excited to have both of you gentlemen here. Thanks for being on the live stream tonight for this discussion.
Okay, thanks, Leighton. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And just to correct one thing, so nobody accuses me of stolen law valor, I was only at one big firm. It was Borden Ladner Gervais.
Okay.
It was the biggest firm in Canada. And then I started my own firm, which was a boutique.
Well, I was including your own firm in that.
Yeah,
that wasn't big.
Well,
I'm a lawyer too. We're all lawyers here, so we know sometimes we overstate the case, right?
Coincidentally, I didn't practice very long either, but coincidentally, it was also at BLG.
Oh, wow. There you go.
We've already it was at the Toronto office, but still same.
And this was when it was BLG, not when it was McMaster.
No, it was Borden and Elliott at the time. This is probably long before your time, David.
Oh no, and I put in like 13 good years of practice. I was at BLG from 2007 to 2010, but I worked there as a student and a stagiaire, and then I started on my own and ran that, and I relinquished my license because voluntarily, in good standing, because the only thing people were doing is filing ethics complaints because they didn't like my anti-Trudeau tweets.
Well, let's start.
If that is your record, you are much older than me.
Well, let's start there. I want to start with that, Viva. So you have a very interesting backstory that maybe some of the people watching don't know about, but your experience with COVID. So we want to start off talking about how, rights and liberties, in particular the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, sort of failed Canadians during that COVID era. And you have a very fascinating anecdotal story about that. You want to talk about that and relate that to, because you did something kind of extreme. That is, you bugged out. You left the country with your family, and tell us how that all occurred.
Sold everything. First I ran for the People's Party of Canada. I said I was going to run for the country before I ran from the country. But no, COVID it was unfortunately an eye-opening experience to see how quickly your nice, polite neighbors can turn into fascist dictators, and how the country you thought was a free and democratic society is not. The charter wasn't worth the digital paper on which it was, coded. So I was a practicing attorney, and I had always been doing the video stuff, and it was not really law-based until about 2016, 2017. And even then it was sort of like very, very tame, legal stuff. COVID hits, and, the channel was sufficiently big, and the world went crazy. And I have to explain to Americans why I think we still live in a free country up in Canada, despite the advent of Bill C-16, back in the day. Mm-hmm. But without getting into the thorough details, COVID hit. I discovered we don't live in a free and democratic society. Arguably what kept America free, people don't like it, but not arguably was the Second Amendment. I said Canada has turned my home into a literal prison where I was on house arrest for 5.5 months in 2021, and then another month and a half in 2022. And I told my wife, like, it was a very organic evolution. Get the hell out of here, because it's not a place to raise kids. We won't be able to do what I do on the internet for very long. And we sold everything, packed up, and left, and ended up in the beautiful free state of Florida.
So you were in Montreal during all the curfews and everything, right? That must have been.
Yeah. It was. I don't want to get your channel in trouble by using hyperbolic rhetoric. It was German era level stuff. My wife had to go to work because she was doing research, and she literally had to have her papers so that she could be out of the house after 8 o'clock for 5 months. And the reason why I was allowed out of the house, thank God for the government, they let us go walk our dogs. It's like people say, well, they weren't doing X, Y, and Z as though to justify the A, B, and C's of tyranny. They were full on tyranny. They just were, they weren't shipping people off to places, although they were forcibly confining people in federal detention centers, these quarantine hotels. It went full fascist real quick. And then afterwards, they reelected and rewarded François Legault's tyranny with more seats. So if they want that fascism and tyranny, they can have it. I don't want it.
Yeah, and the Bloc just won another. The Federal Party just won another by-election in Montreal. But by the way, David, you can call someone a Nazi now as long as they're a Republican in your new country. Bruce, now you speaking of the pandemic, you've talked extensively and written about the Charter and why the Charter has not done or has not operated in the way that many Canadians thought it would. It's disappointed a lot of people. Recently, our Supreme Court declined to hear a case on Section 6, a mobility case. To my knowledge, they haven't heard really any case concerning COVID. Why did the Charter let us down? Why didn't it live up to the expectations that many Canadians had in terms of preserving our rights and freedoms during and then in the aftermath of COVID?
Well, I think it's very simple, actually. It's something that everybody sort of knows, and they sort of make jokes about it. So if you're thinking about freedom of speech, for example, and you think, all right, so what does freedom of speech mean? You'll hear people make the joke that it means whatever the court says that it means, and that might be a joke, but it's true. So people forget that. And then they think that the Charter means something solid. It's in black and white. It's printed on paper. It has words that sound terrific. And so people believe, with a short memory, that they actually have the rights that the Charter states that they do. But the Charter doesn't mean anything without the court. So let's take an example. Take freedom of speech. I think we've talked about this before, Leighton. Say, all right, we have freedom of speech, but what do we know from that short provision? We know immediately that we do not have freedom of speech in the sense that we have something to count on. So how do we know that? Well, just imagine a scenario. I go up to somebody on the sidewalk. I threaten them with bodily injury unless they give me their wallet. Okay? All I've done is speak. That's speech. And the Charter says free speech. And yet, what I've just done is a crime. It's an assault, and I could be charged. So how can those two things coexist? Well, because the line between what is free speech and what is not in the Charter. It's in the decisions of the court. And so the court is the one to draw the line, and they can draw it wherever they want to, as long as they can justify it with jurisprudential rhetoric. And that's what they've done. Right. So there are a lot of things today in Canada that are on the censored sign of the line. And yet we are a country that has a constitutional right to free speech. Now, so do the Americans. And neither provision says very much. And yet the Americans have managed to get a more robust protection as of today. It had some rough spots along the way, but as of today, the Americans' protection is more robust than ours, purely because of the responses of their courts compared to ours.
One of the things that we're seeing, especially in Canada, but also to some extent in the United States, especially in the aftermath of COVID, is we're seeing legislatures, especially the federal governments in Canada and the US, taking steps legislatively to restrict freedom of speech. A number of bills have been passed in Canada restricting free speech, talking about hate speech and disinformation, amendments to the criminal code. But Viva, even in the United States, now this has become an election issue because Mr. Walz and Kamala Harris, they're talking about hate speech and misinformation and certain types of speech being a threat to democracy. This has become a big election issue now in the US, hasn't it?
Well, I was actually just looking at the clip Elon Musk retweeted of Tim Walz saying there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech. What we're witnessing, it's the term gets thrown around a lot, communism or statism, whatever you want to call it. It's a war on the people's ability to speak freely and exchange ideas freely. And it starts off with the most noblest of intentions, as we've seen in Canada. It started off with hate speech, and then you get the courts in there to come define what hate speech is. What I love is the charter. I mean, all of us lawyers love this. It's the first provision. It says the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And we discovered during COVID, that means whatever the hell the court system wants to say it means, depending on the political pressure of the time. And so in America, it's unclear whether or not it's the Second Amendment protecting the First Amendment, but you have almost a religious respect for the First Amendment in America. You can go up and tell someone to go F themselves. You can misgender someone all you want. And unless you're calling for imminent direct violence against a specific person or group, you're going to have to suck it up, Buttercup, and live with it. And America has maintained that. But the pressure coming from they're literally Marxists or communists, the Walz-Harris campaign, it comes under the guise of, we gotta save lives, as if the misinformation that cost the lives during COVID was what was censored, and it was what was coming from the government. But the bottom line is we would never have known that, and they would never have lost that power had they had that control in the first place. And so, it's a full global, especially focused in the West, attack on free speech under the guise of hate speech. When someone think of the children, and we got to save people from the risks of misinformation.
Bruce, it's interesting, just to pick up on what Viva just said, that we're seeing this happen throughout the West. In France, there's this lady, I believe it was Marine Le Pen, who's she's been accused of misinformation, disinformation. Nigel Farage in Britain. Pierre Poilievre in Canada has been accused of this. Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Milei in Argentina, the same attack all the time, misinformation, disinformation, anytime someone stands up and questions the government narrative. And thus far, it doesn't seem like these charters or bills of rights and freedoms have been able to do very much to stop this sort of government onslaught. Do you have an explanation for perhaps why these in these different countries in the West, first of all, why rights and freedoms are so much under attack, and why they don't seem to be doing a very effective job of protecting individual freedom?
Yeah. So let's start with this. We are transitioning into a managerial age. So you have in the law right now, if you like, two paradigms or frameworks that are competing against each other. And they have sort of a list of principles or characteristics that are in conflict with each other. And so the law has become incoherent. But it's a battle between an older paradigm, that is what I would call the liberal paradigm, and a post-liberal paradigm. And the post-liberal paradigm is managerial, meaning that the governments believe that their job is to manage the people, manage their behavior, manage their speech. And that means that free speech can't be given the kind of status that is imagined in the U.S. Constitution as the courts have interpreted it. It means that governments believe, quite genuinely, some of them, that what you say must be supervised by some government official to make sure that it's not contrary to the government's interest. And I know that sounds crazy from a Western liberal point of view, and it is, but it's not crazy from their point of view because they believe in the management idea. And if you believe in that, anything goes.
Leighton, do you mention there's a common theme running through all of those names? Milei, Le Pen, Farage, let's see who else.
Bolsonaro.
Yeah. Populist leaders who were fighting what we would refer to as the New World Order or the global government. It's quite obvious that free speech is the tool of power of the people against the government, which is why the government needs to come in and rein it in through whatever nonsense pretext that they have, as they've been doing in Canada. But what is empowering a little bit, or I should say, instills optimism, is the fight is becoming increasingly more fought by the people everywhere now. And there's pushback, in the UK, although it might be a little too late, because they're literally jailing people for social media posts, which are themselves not factually incorrect, but matters of opinion.
Coming soon to Canada.
Well, if Trudeau had his way, absolutely. But there's a pushback in Canada now.
Right. And, but see, this, I totally agree. But this is sort of what happened during COVID. This is what came to the fore, right? So you had a COVID regime that was very hands-on, very managerial, very manipulative. And the only thing really that got in the way was the free speech that the internet provided. Everybody communicating with everybody else saying that's not true, or that's not what happened, or this doesn't work. And it undermined the regime's agenda. And so that free, let's put it this way, that free speech actually was a threat to the regime. It wasn't a threat to the country. It wasn't a threat to the people, but it was a threat to the regime, which is why they reacted to it so strongly, and why that contest is still going on. If this kind of lockdown agenda is to be tried again, they have to figure out the free speech bit of it first, so that the same thing doesn't happen.
And channeling Kierkegaard again, my favorite expression of all time is life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. We go back now to 2016 when Trump won the election. They blamed it on too much free speech on the internet, and they had to tamp down. And so all of the signs were there a decade ago. They just really they overplayed their hand during COVID. But what just drives me nuts. If you want to talk about the misinformation, disinformation killing people, it was literally what the government was saying. COVID didn't come from a lab in China. Face masks work. The jibby jab is safe and effective. Hydroxychloroquine cannot be used as a treatment yet. They literally cost lives through their disinformation. And had we had unfettered, uncensored free speech, lives would have been saved, and lots of them. So it is the ultimate irony, but they don't care about free speech, hate speech, or anything, disinformation. They just want control over language and thought.
Right. So full circle back to your original question, Leighton. So if this happens again, or when it happens again, the charter is not going to work next time either. So something has to change. Right.
One of the things that people are talking about is returning to more of an original concept of federalism. And when I did some research on the Alberta Bill of Rights, which we're going to talk about, I found out that James Madison, who essentially authored the American Bill of Rights, he didn't think much of the project. In fact, he thought it was, I think he said something like it was like a list of promises that the government might or might not keep. He thought that the real key to protecting individual rights and freedoms, or liberty more broadly, was the structure of federalism. And you talked a little bit about this when you were on my show last time, Bruce, about the push and pull between the different branches of power, the legislative, judicial, and the executive, and how over time that has been the best sort of bulwark against any particular branch of government becoming overly powerful. And perhaps that's a better way to protect liberty than a Bill of Rights that governments don't have much respect for. Is federalism breaking down in the United States and Canada as well? What do you think about that?
Well, the problem with it is the same problem as with the charter, which is it is ultimately up to the courts to decide where the lines are.
Right.
So if you have so we've run into this in Canada. You can think of sections of the Constitution that give the power to the provinces of the feds, and a case comes along, and the courts decide that it doesn't mean what it says. It's happened before.
Carbon tax reference. Albertans would say carbon tax reference.
Tax reference is one of them.
Yeah. Sure. Although having said that, Alberta really liked the decisions, for example, on Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, and they also liked the plastics reference, which seemed to be an indication that the courts were willing to show some respect for the division of powers.
Sure. But the
You
point
know,
is, you're always subject to whatever it is they want to do today,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's not a waste of time. Don't get me wrong. It's not a waste of time to have these things articulated in your constitutional document. But
Mhm.
but our constitutional order that's based upon checks and balances works only as long as the people in power respect that idea.
Do you agree with that, Viva? What do
As
you
long
think?
Well,
as yeah.
no, absolutely. I was just my experience now, having lived in Canada and now having moved to the States. There is a lot more respect for state rights in America. It's almost sort of built into the fabric of the country that it is a republic, these United States of America. And
Mhm.
had it not been for the federal undertaking to respect state sovereignty, you would not have had these United States of America. So although there is ever increasing encroachment, the federal is there like a big blob trying to usurp all state autonomy. But there still is a culture of respecting it much more than what I noticed in Canada. And now I really do understand. So I'm choking on my own tongue here. I do understand the movement of Wexit now. Like, I understand why
Yes.
the folks out west, they're like, screw you, federal government. You come and you plunder our riches. You redistribute it to the eastern provinces. Ontario and Quebec decide the elections, and you are basically oppressing us. Well, let's get the hell out of this federation because it's not doing us any good. And I understand it now, but I also understand that it doesn't seem that people give a sweet bugger all up in Canada. It is the federal controlling the country, and the provinces are sitting there like the willing victims. But we still have, at least on paper and a little bit in culture, much more respect for state rights in the States, and they fight for them a lot more than
Mhm.
provincial rights in Canada.
Mhm. Well, this is the interesting thing about Canada, for that matter, the United States. Even though we've had this incredible overreach and, in some ways, unprecedented encroachment on individual rights and liberties and civil liberties, really hardly anybody's talking about rights. Nobody's talking about, revisiting the charter or things like that, with one exception, and that seems to be Alberta. And just turning to a project that I've been involved with, this renovated Alberta Bill of Rights. Alberta had has a Bill of Rights that was passed in the early 1970s, back in the Peter Lougheed days. And But now, in the aftermath of COVID, Premier Smith has been going around the province at town hall meetings, and she's trumpeting about this new Bill of Rights. So the question is, why is this? And just by way of explanation, I think it fits in within Premier Smith's plan for Alberta sovereignty. So the first bill that her government passed when she came to power a couple of years ago was the Sovereignty Act, which drew a lot of criticism, but really is just a restatement of the provincial powers that already exist under Section 92 of our Constitution. But this new Bill of Rights goes into more detail, more specific protection of individual rights and freedoms. And so I'm interested to get your take on this, in that it's something sort of unique that's happening in North America. But is it particular? A couple of questions. What do you think of it? Is it particular to Alberta? And do you think that it's something that could start a trend, particularly in Canada? What do you think, Bruce?
Well, I think it's worth doing, and I hope it succeeds. I think you'll be better off with it than without it, but it's not a panacea.
Yeah.
I think it would be a mistake to think that if you get this, your problems will be solved. That's
Mhm.
not going to be the case.
Mhm.
But I think the idea of an Alberta firewall is terrific. I think it's long overdue, given the kind of abuse that you alluded to a minute ago.
Mhm.
There are some practical problems, of course. It'll be a statute of the Alberta
Right.
legislature, not a part of the Constitution.
Mhm.
It will be subject to the federal provincial division of powers. It'll be subject to the court's interpretation. All of those things won't be solved by putting new rights into an Alberta statute. But you'll be better off with them than without them.
Mhm. A couple of yeah, go ahead.
Oh no,
David.
not. I'm not going to be contrarian for the sake of it, but I don't know. Better with it than without it. We already have a charter of rights. It's not worth it's not worth anything. And you have the courts that come in and say, basically, great, you have a charter, you have guaranteed rights. And the risk was not the notwithstanding clause at Section 33. The risk is the caveat that good, enjoy your rights. We can infringe on them whenever we want, so long as it's justified in a free and democratic society. And with the pressure of the tyrants, the vocal minority, that becomes you can't say anything anymore without it violating someone else's rights. So good, you have another. It looks good on paper, but it's practically useless, especially when the courts don't enforce our existing rights. So,
that's basically what I mean. I mean, I totally agree with what David just said. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is what I mean by it's not a panacea. And the problem is this: it's difficult to figure out what else to do, and there are things that could be done, but they would be at a different level. They would be like at a level of constitutional reform, even so far as to try and change the model. Like, how do you change the constitutional order that you're living under so that you're not reliant upon the interpretation of the courts for the meaning of your rights? Now, that's a sticky problem.
Yes.
But I agree,
No, it's so sticky that even when you have the words "shall not be infringed," they find a way to infringe on those rights. And
absolutely.
It is wild because, I mean, you guys must be following the Canadian cases coming out of the federal court during COVID. It's obscene. The government designated quarantine facilities, as I like to say, like federal kidnapping, were deemed to not be a violation of your charter rights. The curfew, it wasn't even that it's a violation, but it's justified. In Quebec, they said the curfew was not a violation of your charter rights. We've got a broken system. Like, people who don't practice law don't understand. The law is human. And you got these political players, which are the judges. And my only practical solution to all of it is make it so politically unpopular among the people to render these idiotic decisions that they are sort of not bowing to the pressure of the mob, just bowing to the pressure of good reason and good sense in terms of what our God-given rights were. They're not to be taken away by mere mortals.
The currency of the legal system is legitimacy. And as long as the people think it's legitimate, it'll carry on. So until you get a critical mass of people thinking the way David described, nothing will change.
You guys are up in Canada. You are nowhere near that critical mass. Like, I don't want to.
No.
I don't want to undermine the freedom fighters and the people who are pushing up there. But if I had to guess, it's 90+% of Canada thinks it's good the way it is, so long as you can sip your coffee and have your pint of beer in the Trois Brasseurs, wherever in Montreal, then you're good enough. So long as the sidewalks are good enough, it's good enough, and don't complain about everything. We're not North Korea. We just lock you down in your house for 5 months.
I would say that the percentage is maybe not quite as high as 90 in Alberta, but you guys both just threw hand grenades into a project that I've been working on for 2 years, but that's okay. A couple of things I want to ask you about. There's 22 listed rights in what we propose to the Alberta government, but there's 2 that I want to get your take on, and I think maybe are important and unique and are probably going to attract judicial scrutiny. The first is in this Bill of Rights, and this will be in the Bill of Rights. The Premier has gone around and she said it's going to, first of all, they're going to table it in the fall legislature in Alberta, so it's going to go before the legislature. They have a majority government, so presumably they're going to pass it. And she said bodily autonomy, individual bodily autonomy, informed consent is going to be part of that Bill of Rights. And do you think, Viva, that is something that is significant, or do you make the same argument? Well, it's not really worth the paper it's written.
I was just going to go Google the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and see which one of our life, liberty, and autonomy was already in the Canadian Charter, the federal charter. It will not make one iota of difference, not to blackpill you, Leighton, not a lick of a difference. You'll get a judge that says, yeah, you got your autonomy, but we're in a very scary pandemic right now, so screw your, here's 2 middle fingers to your autonomy. And then just wait till you start getting the other political pushback. You're going to have to get people in there saying, my right to bodily autonomy compels you to refer to me as something that I'm not biologically because of my own bodily autonomy. So you're going to get conflicting rights where someone's going to say,
yes,
I have the right to be referred to as what I think of myself as, and you don't have the right to speak freely with your own conscience. So not to be blackpilled, it won't do anything. And the courts are going to come right in and say, yeah, you got that nice charter there, but we've got a big scary bug. So you got to shut up and take the jab. And if you don't, you lose your job.
I think it's worse than that. Believe it or not, I think it's worse than that. So bodily autonomy does not mean that there can't be requirements on what you have to do, as long as it's not mandatory in the sense that you still have a choice, which is the argument that they made from the very beginning, right? So you don't have to get a vaccine, But if you don't, you can't fly in a plane. Okay.
Mhm,
That
mhm,
is not a violation of bodily autonomy.
mhm.
That is creating a requirement that you can choose. And this is the argument from the very beginning, but there's some validity to it. Here's why. So let's say that there's a provincial rule that says that if you're in a retail establishment, like a restaurant or a store, you have to wear a shirt and shoes. And if you don't want to wear a shirt and shoes, then don't go into the store.
Mhm.
Okay. Is that a violation of your bodily autonomy? No. But the vaccine mandate works the same way. Now,
Mhm.
people are going to say, oh, but a vaccine is much more serious than shirt and shoes. Of course it is. But in the abstract, it is abstractly similar to require somebody to put something on their body that they don't want to do. And the price is to go into the store or not. Okay. Same thing. So the idea of having a vaccine passport does not violate the idea of informed consent, because you can decide whether or not to go to the doctor or the drugstore to get a vaccine, and when you're there to give consent or not. Okay.
Mhm.
So I get the idea that the provision is aimed at, but it won't have the effect that I think is intended.
No,
Mhm.
I don't just say
Mhm.
like the idea is to reaffirm rights that you already had that the courts did not respect in the first place. I mean,
Yeah.
great, you're not playing whack-a-mole, you're playing like fool me once type game. Although just to push back, the logical response to that would be agree, wearing a shirt, some might say it's a violation of bodily autonomy. Whereas, the argument is obviously something going into your body, chemically changing your body,
Of course.
impacting the natural. So that's where like where the people will raise that argument. Well, you got to wear no shoes, no, what is it? No shoes, no shirt, no service. So just wear the face mask. And I would then argue that one is having a physiological impact on your body above and
Right.
beyond.
But you see, I don't disagree with that. I really don't. But the thing is, now we're arguing about facts and
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
about legal concepts. As soon as you get into the facts as to determine, whether or not something is risky or serious or what it means or what it'll do to you, you've lost. You've lost
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
you have to fence off that right, that decision for the individual. And as soon as that gets into a different realm, you're toast.
No, and
Mhm.
especially since I can play the devil's advocate, someone's going to say my right to bodily autonomy means not getting sick because you're a sick person who's
Of
running
course.
around coughing your
Of
COVID.
course, of course. I
So
mean,
it's
Mhm. Mhm.
it's a wild thing because it really is the difference between the individual right and the collective greater good right. And we have seen historically where that goes, and we've seen in real time where that goes. The greater
yes,
good means. Oh,
but
sorry, go for it.
let's just try that though. So, there's lots of sticky situations here. So let's try this. Let's say a store creates a rule on its own, like not demanded by the province, suggested maybe, but not demanded. A store chain creates a rule that says you can't come in here without a mask and a vaccine. Okay. Now, are we going to say that this is a collective versus individual? No, that's the clash of two private rights. The store has possession of the land. They're a landowner or occupier. And if we are going to go along with our traditional idea of what property rights entail, that occupier has the ability to set the rules for entry.
Mhm.
Right. And so it's not so simple just to say, well, it's an individual right to refuse to do whatever you want to do. Yes, it should be. But on the other hand, the occupiers of property should also have the rule to set the rules for entry. So if
Mhm.
that means that you have to get one to enter, I'm not sure that's a collective problem.
Mhm.
I would predict that store would not be in business for very long, and
But you see, but I hope that would be true, and that's the way the thing should be resolved. If you make a decision as a company and the decision backfires and nobody goes in, then you get what you deserve. It's not
So,
because they don't have a legal right to make the rule; it's that the rule is foolish.
taking a just sort of a 40,000-foot view of this, what we're talking about a little bit here, Bruce, you said earlier that what we're witnessing is a movement towards the managerial state, away from, let's say, classical liberalism, which
Yes.
is where the whole concepts of rights and freedoms as we understand them are based. You can trace them actually all the way back to the Old Testament, if you like. But under our system of government, whether it's Canada, the US, the legislature is supreme. and yet it's not working out that way. It turns out we're actually living in societies where, in fact, judges have sort of this super priority over the other branches of government. And here, with the Alberta Bill of Rights, we have at least an attempt for the legislature to tell the judiciary, look, this is what we think the relationship between the state and the individual should look like. And you're saying, well, the courts aren't going to have any of it. What's the antidote then? How does the legislature become supreme again? Is that even possible?
Well, but there's an irony here, though, right? Because what you have when a legislature makes a Bill of Rights, whether it's constitutional or a statute, what it essentially is doing is giving power to the courts to rule over it.
Yeah.
Because if it didn't make the Bill of Rights, that would mean that the legislature could continue to make whatever rules it wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a funny kind of thing. The legislature is now asking the courts to supervise the legislature. And if you don't want power in the courts, then don't make a Bill of Rights. This underlines a mistake that I think we made in our Constitution over a long period of time. So if you just imagine these three stages, okay? Here's the first stage. You have a king, a powerful king. And what we do over a long period of time is take power from the king and give it to legislatures. And that's good, right? Because legislatures are elected. Power to the people, right? And then the Americans first, and later, much later, the Canadians, they do a Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights takes power from the legislature and gives it to the courts and says, here are the things the legislature is not allowed to do. And then what happens is that both the legislature and the courts together give power back to the king. And the king's not there anymore. It's now the administrative state. Yeah. The legislature delegates rulemaking authority, and the courts defer to its expertise. So these three checks and balances, they're all working together. They're all on the same page. They're not checks and balances. They're colluding together to establish a managerial age.
So, Viva, is there a solution? I mean, for example, can we fettering the discretion of courts to interpret things in certain ways? Is that a solution? What do you think?
The idea, the solution that I always had is that it's true. You got the legislature that drafts the laws, then you get your courts that interpret them, and then you get your media that, in theory, holds the feet of the government to the fire, but doesn't anymore. And what we've ended up with is, like you said, three entities that have reformed back into one, but it's an even bigger blob than it was right at the beginning. I don't know what the solution is. Never violence. So setting aside a 1776 revolution, what would that even look like today? The solution is not violence. The solution, as far as I can tell, is, on the one hand, it has to get bad enough for even those Ottawa folk who thought they were inconvenienced by the protest to realize the government has far too much power. And then I think it just takes like a sort of bottom up, top down, to sound a little bit like Kamala Harris, always twirling. But people have got to change the political climate to where it's not acceptable for judges to come out and say, yeah, we're gonna ratify everything the government did and then some. And that is the push and pull of the populist movement, which is why the government comes in extra hard to try to shut it down and demonize all those populist politicians who want to listen to the people. I mean, the idea that populism has been vilified as a term and a concept just goes to show you how close to communism we are right now. Mm-hmm. But that's the only solution I can see. Waking up, not everybody. And I don't know who said it. You don't need to wake up the sheep. You need to gather the lions. And the critical mass really is only 10 to 15%, so that you can change public opinion, pressure the media, or at least be the media that changes public perception, so that it's no longer cool for judges to say, yeah, I know we got a drive-through liquor store, but we're going to shut down your drive-through church because of COVID. So that's what I think the solution is. It takes time, and it takes a whole hell of a lot of grinding effort day in and day out. But the only other option is the one that's not an option as far as I'm concerned.
So populism. What do you think, Bruce?
Well, I essentially agree. I think one of the groups of people that you have to persuade that something is wrong is that group that has been going along with all of this out of a sense of self-interest. They think they're going to be spared. They think that they get to be on the team that's winning, and don't realize that they are part of the population that is going to actually lose. I'm speaking of sort of polite society. I'm speaking of the capitalists, the corporate interests, the energy companies. There are an awful lot. I mean, the vast majority of powerful entities in the country have been at least behaving and speaking as though they're totally on board with all of this, whether it's COVID or climate change action or DEI or whatever the case may be. They have obeyed.
Would you include the academy in that?
Oh, well, listen, I think it's worse in the academy. I think a lot of these bad ideas started in the academy. So I'm not sure that
law schools.
Oh, listen, law schools are part and parcel of the academy, and they're the pipeline for new lawyers and judges. So if you think you've got a judiciary that is neck deep into social justice ideology, then you can look at the law schools as one of the sources of that problem.
So I'm going to ask both of you this question. Now, is there a future, and what is the future for individual rights and freedoms, civil liberties in the United States and Canada? Is there a future for them, or is the managerial state and the technology now that's supporting it and driving it really going to obviate the effectiveness of any sort of rights charter or Bill of Rights or anything like that? What do you think, Viva?
I had on this, if someone puts together a montage of me giving this anecdote, it'll sound just as dumb as Kamala Harris is unburdened by what has been. But I had Neil Oliver on a while back, and he said something that I'll never forget, because I said, it's gotten too big to fail now. Like they've amassed too much power. They're working together, government, courts, media, and it's too big to fail. And he said with his beautiful Scottish accent, it's like, no, it gets too big to succeed. As again, his idea was it gets too big to not fail. And at some point, look, it only took 80 million people dying under communism to realize that, by the time they told us that Chernobyl wasn't a real thing and those fetuses born with fishtails were actually healthy babies, that's when things broke. So it will get too big to continue to be on the way that it's on. And it will take people realizing, truly appreciating the Ayn Rand principle that there is no greater minority than the individual. And if you don't respect individual rights, you don't respect minority rights. And that the greater good is individual rights, period. And people realize that when they start coming for their house, for their taxes, for their children. And they realize, the not in my backyard only works until they're in my backyard. And by then it's too late. So the old expression, if you don't learn from history, you're bound to repeat it. People don't learn from that World War II poem. They came for the social workers, and I said nothing. But that's what it will take, and we're getting there. We're getting there to the point where people are saying, I can't report on my own. I don't know if I want to get you in trouble, but vaccine injury. Like I can't report. I can't share my own anecdotes. And then, sure enough, over time, even the YouTube commies have to bend that rule. All right, if it's your own personal anecdote, you could share it after 2 years of shutting down accounts for having done it. So it has to get so bad that people realize that the greater good is respecting individual rights and liberties. We'll get there. It's just a question of tens of millions of people are going to die in the process, not to get violent.
What do you think, Bruce? Do you think that we've sort of outgrown the usefulness of these rights charters? Or what is the future for rights and freedoms in places like United States and Canada?
Well, this is kind of the irony. They don't work, and yet you can't get rid of them. You don't want to get rid of them because they are the thing to which people can go back and say, look, we're supposed to have them. What is going on? We're supposed to have this right and that right and that right. So the kind of objections that we had during COVID, even though it didn't work, were important to make because it's the thing that stops it from getting worse. I mean, both the silver lining of COVID was that, referring back to David's reference to the idea of too big to succeed, too big not to fail. I mean, COVID was a train wreck, an absolute train wreck. Right? The policies didn't work. It caused a lot of harm. People were miserable. The whole thing didn't work. It just did not work. And yet, so on the good side, they exposed themselves. They overreached. And a lot of people saw right in front of their eyes that the thing didn't make sense. And they saw the infringement of their own civil liberties. A good proportion of the population now can see what they could not see before COVID.
I think, unfortunately, a lot of them have not just gone back to shutting their eyes, have gone back to deceiving themselves because they feel so
Yeah.
stupid for having bought
This is
into a lot of it.
this is the flip side. Unfortunately, that alone was not enough. That experience, you'd think that experience alone would be enough,
Well,
but it turns out not to be, right?
and-
So, you know, what else do we have
Yeah.
to have before?
The American equivalent of the Freedom Convoy is sort of choose your Trump rally. Is that why they're trying to kill him? What do you think, David?
Oh, dude, they're so convinced they're going to lose. Well, first of all, I think they're trying this because they're genuinely trying to get into World War III. I mean, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. It's they need catastrophe to consolidate their powers and to justify their managerial regime. I mean, tyrannical regime. So they need catastrophe. They need chaos for it. And there's not a doubt in my mind that the Secret Service is facilitating a situation to allow this to happen. Not a doubt in my mind. Every time they get up and give a press conference as to how on point they are. Oh, we worked properly. We got this one yesterday. The guy at the golf course. They are highlighting their incompetence to the world and basically egging on more of these types of things. But I was going to say one thing. Oh, darn it, I forget. It was about. No. I was going to say, well, how bad does it have to get? Just to bring it back to Canada, and let's get a little controversial for the time being. How, people they can't believe what the government's doing. They can't believe what the lies they've told them. And when does it become enough? The irony is, did you see the video of Danielle Smith's member of parliament, or I forget what the politician's name was?
Johnson, something like that.
Jennifer Johnson, and being lectured by a man that she has to refer to this man as a woman. That's the point where a lot of women are like, all right, yeah, I've been very tolerant to people saying like, I consider me a woman, yada, yada, yada. But then when it gets into women's sports, then they're like, okay, but you're a man. And then when they're lecturing women on tolerance, that's when people start to say, yeah, now you've pushed it a little too far. And now let's go back to everybody respecting everyone's respective bubbles and not compelling that of others in the name of my own selfishness and my own delusions. That's what, that's how bad it had to get for women to finally say, all right, it's one thing that, a man wants to dress up like a woman or do whatever to their body, but I'm not competing with them. And I'm not going to sit here and get lectured by a man that I have to call a man a woman when the woman's got a deeper voice than Barry White. So, I mean, that's how bad it has to get before people actually put their foot down and say enough is enough, piss off. I mean, and we're getting there. But it's true. A lot of people want to forget about COVID, but now they've got to face the new iteration of the COVID madness, which is the 2S LGBTQIA+, trans women or women nonsense. But that's getting bad enough that women are starting to push back finally.
Yeah, governments are supposed to, one of the jobs that they have is to protect our borders and to protect our citizens. But in Canada, we have the diametrical opposite in that we have a prime minister who recently pledged support for not only for Ukraine, but for the idea that long-range missiles, bombs could be launched against Russia, which drew a response from Mr. Putin. And so we have our prime minister to Canada who's actually not only not protecting the individual rights and freedoms or even the safety of individual Canadians, but is really imperiling the entire country, which is really a bizarre scenario, isn't it, Bruce? Like, it seems as though this government, the one we have in Canada, especially in Ottawa, doesn't really understand what their job is anymore.
Well, the ideology is almost pathological. It's almost suicidal. This is like the country committing suicide in slow motion. I mean, the combination of all these policies, none of which make sense, would make you think that there's something wrong somewhere in the way somebody is thinking about this. It just doesn't make sense if your objective is the welfare of the country that you're leading. And so it's a very twisted phenomenon. And people who are more knowledgeable than me about psychology have suggested that the ideology upon which this managerial age is based is full of strange twists and turns inside the mind. And I couldn't comment further on that, but it certainly makes sense to me.
Will weigh my words less. It's absolutely psychotic. There's no other way to describe it, this administration that we have globally. But it's a question of causing chaos so they can make more work for themselves and justify further control over the population. But I had to pull up the article about Justin Trudeau talking about gender inclusive demining for sustainable futures in Ukraine. I mean, it's actually psychotic. It's actual insanity, and the psychopaths have taken control of the ship. The patients are running the asylum here. I mean, we want to go to World War III, but we want it to be gender inclusive. That's right. How much we love the transgender movement. It's like, well, the transgenders, you can go demine Ukraine. But it is. There's no other word. It's psychotic. It's like the wrong things have been rewarded for the longest of times, and the wrong people have ascended to power. And they get to this point where they are utterly disconnected from reality, to the point where they think being benevolent means gender inclusivity in the wars that they're starting. But I do hope there is a hell, because a lot of these people deserve to burn for an eternity.
There seems to be symmetry in what the Democrats and the Liberals are saying, and they both seem to be incredibly unpopular, notwithstanding some of the polls in the U.S., which I don't believe. So is this a sign of hope, Bruce? Do you think that there could be a legislative change in the United States and Canada, and that could lead to perhaps more protection or a renaissance of protection of individual rights and freedoms in our countries?
Well, one could hope, and certainly it will be way better than what we've got now. And so let's cross our fingers. But let's take the large view, though. So one of the tests of a constitutional order is whether or not it can withstand bad leaders. Like the only reason for having a constitution in the first place is because people are trouble. Like not specific people, but people in general. Anybody can be evil, corrupt, or stupid. Most people who get close to power get corrupted in some way. And so the whole point of having a constitution is to make sure that those people don't make a mess of things while they're in power. And if they can, then the constitution doesn't work. And by that criteria, the constitutions of a lot of Western countries have failed, including Canada's. And so the bigger project, and there's no prospect for it right now, but the bigger project is we have to rethink the way this country is built from the ground up. We have to live under a different kind of constitutional order, and what that is will require an awful lot of creativity and thinking. But I'm sorry, I think that's the lesson.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because when you think about Britain, of course, before the Magna Carta was evil King John. And then the bloody 17th century in England gave us the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights. And then if you look at the U.S., the founding fathers, that all grew out of a revolutionary war to get away from a despotic king. So this is a great point. I mean, and almost I don't want to sort of be sort of Pollyanna about it, but almost an inspiring point, because if you take what you said, Bruce, and I'd like you to comment on this, David, maybe this is an opportunity to rethink, to renovate our constitutional structures. And I think that's what the Alberta Bill is aimed at. But do you agree, David, that maybe that's what we should be doing? We should be getting back to original first principles, or even rethinking them, and maybe refashioning them for the modern age. What do you think about that?
I don't want to doom pill you too much on the legislation that you're working on, Leighton. I feel bad being
it's too late for that. You've already
Debbie down here. I have no faith in legislation when the courts will not uphold the legislation. I have no faith in legislators when they legislate absolute insanity. And I have no faith in the politicians when they are bought and paid for. It's a weird thing. The only thing I have faith in is ultimately the power of the collective consciousness to say at some point, and it's, hopefully it's sooner than later, this is madness, this is insanity, and we won't put up with it anymore. And then maybe find the politicians who are susceptible to public opinion. The funny thing is, Pierre Poilievre, his foibles might be his assets. He is a fair weather politician who will go with the tide of public opinion And so get public opinion to push these politicians in the right direction might be one way to do it. Bankrupt the fake media and defund the CBC. Get that politically popular to the point where it happens. Once they lose their tentacles of control, and the biggest one is the media, they don't get to sway public opinion to support these insane public policies. They don't get to manufacture consent or pad, the reporting on these insane court decisions. The fact that coming out of Canada, for those who don't know, Picton. Oh, geez, I'm sorry, I forgot his Picton, the constitutional piece. But what's his last name now? I'm drawing the last living signatory to the Constitution.
Oh, Peckford, Brian Peckford.
Peckford, not Picton. Jeez Louise, Peckford.
Picton is he was the murderer from BC.
Sorry, Mr. Peckford. I'm very sorry. I did not mean that. The fact that his constitutional challenge was tossed for moot, that's unacceptable. And that should be a populist uprising, and that should be a media outrage. And the media is not going to do it because they're bought and paid for. And so it'll happen. It'll happen, but it's going to be slow.
David, you're reminding me of a movie from the 70s called Network.
Oh yeah, get mad as hell.
I'm not going to take it anymore. What do you think? What do you think, Bruce?
Well, I don't disagree, but it begs the question, right? So I'm really talking about a different sort of level of looking at the problem. Right. I agree with the problems that David is talking about, but so let's ask these kinds of difficult questions, like how could you have a constitutional order in which one branch of the state, that is the courts, is not the one deciding what the state can do? Right. How do you actually separate those functions so that the state as a whole isn't always running the show? Is it possible? Is it possible to have a state that both protects our liberty, as in protects us from coercion from everybody else, but is not so powerful as to be its leading threat? And how do you arrange things so that we have a state that does its job, but is not powerful enough to go outside it? And I don't know exactly what the answer to those questions are, but I have some ideas.
Here's sort of a final thought. I know that David's got to go, but I'm interested to get each of your take on this. Let's face it, these original rights charters in some ways are based upon, let's call them, or they spring from Judeo-Christian values. Canada and the United States are very secular countries now, especially Canada. But would you agree that if we're going to have respect for individual rights and freedoms, that we would have to be operating on some sort of, I guess what Richard Dawkins calls some concept of cultural Christianity? In other words, is there a way to have a secular society that still has respect for individual fundamental rights and freedoms? What do you think about that, David?
This is another one where I've had something of an evolution on. I don't consider myself to be religious, but my goodness, I would rather live in a Christian society than a godless society. And when you say Canada, it's no longer secular. The Democrat Party of America is no longer secular. It's not secular. It's godless, but it's
anti-human.
It's anti. But the thing is, it's godless and anti-human, but not in a non-religious sense, but in a bad religion sense.
Right.
People, I've come to appreciate that people need religion or a religious type structure. And if they don't get it from religion, they're going to get it from government. They're going to get it from bad religion. They're going to get it from cults. They're going to get it from ideologies. They're going to, the transgender movement is an iteration of religious ideations, but just absolutely not based on God or fundamental values. And they got their rituals. They've got their sacrifices. They've got their garment.
Their flag.
The flag, they got they've got their outer appearances, like wear a kippah and then I know you're Jewish. Put the freaking flag in your bio and I know that you're of cult. So I don't think that I don't believe there can be a culture or a society that is secular. I think it becomes godless and sinful to some extent. And so bringing back good Judeo-Christian values or Christian values, if you don't like the Judeo qualification, yes, a lot of bad stuff has happened under Christianity over thousands of years, but that's how things evolve into what they are now. You don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and the good principles that have been abandoned by modern secular or godless society has resulted in what we're witnessing right now. Child genital mutilation, the legalization of all sorts of drugs, decriminalization of hard drugs. And what has it produced? It's produced a godless and basically suicidal society.
Yes, but and the but is that you can't have Christians in charge that want to become their own kind of tyrants. You can't have somebody saying, look, this is my interpretation of my holy book, and you will all do this, even if you don't agree. I mean, that's just exchanging one kind of tyranny for another.
Yes.
So yes, basically to your question, Leighton, but let's not forget that big but. You cannot turn the thing just from one bad situation into another one.
Into a theocracy.
But that is the ebb and flow of the push and pull of the powers, and why they say it's a pendulum that when the parties that are not in power love freedom of speech, when they get into power, all of a sudden they're not so keen on it, and then you get the minority parties like, well, we want some freedom of speech here, and it's the ebb and flow, and you get people saying that we need to bring back religion. Yes, true. I have no problem with 10 commandments in school. I think it's probably a good lesson for people to learn. Who could ever object to that? But if it's not the 10 commandments, it's going to be literally the trans flag. And so trans flag comes up, people get pissed, bring back the 10 commandments. Oh, you went too far.
I don't think
Take it away.
True. I don't think that's true. What is so difficult about having a society that is based on classical liberal principles? I mean,
ultimately, it's run by people. Is the bottom line problem. And
well, yeah, but that's what your constitution is supposed to do. It's supposed to protect you from the people and establish rule of law instead of rule of persons. I mean, that's the thing that we failed at. The whole idea was we're supposed to be insulated from the idiosyncrasies of the individuals, and that has not worked.
Yeah, well, because it's up to the idiosyncrasies of the individuals to rein in the power of the idiosyncrasies of the individuals.
That's right.
I love that we got the fireworks right at the end. Speaking as a Christian conservative in Canada, I feel like I'm in the pit and the pendulum, to borrow from your metaphor, David. This has been a wonderful discussion. I've learned so much from listening to you, gentlemen. Hopefully this has been edifying and enjoyable for everybody who's listened in and watched. I want to thank both of you for taking the time to be with us. I know you're both very, very busy with the different projects that you're doing. David, first of all, tell us where people can find you and follow all of your content.
Well, if you put in Viva Frei in the Google search, you'll find me everywhere under Viva Frei, Twitter, the Viva Frei, vivabarneslaw.locals.com. But I've got a good search result now. If you just put in my name, David Freihate or Viva Frei, you'll find me. I'm everywhere, and I just got called a far-right podcaster by some
Congratulations.
Badge of courage. That's like being called Sir Viva Frei.
I'll take
Bruce, tell us about your rights project that you've been working on.
Yes, so Rights Probe, everybody can find all our Rights Probe work at rightsprobe.org, and they can follow me on Twitter at Pardy Bruce. Thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. This has been, I think, our best ever live space, thanks to these two guests.
Leighton, before we go, what is your backdrop? Is that a law library, or is that the Sistine? It can't be the Sistine Chapel.
It's a law library. I believe this is at Cambridge.
Okay, I was going to say
I'm not actually at Cambridge, but
I was going to say Sistine Chapel or something, but then it wasn't classical enough, so I figured.
It's the Sistine Chapel of the legal universe.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful.
Well, you guys are beautiful. Thanks a lot for being here. You're beautiful.
It's been a treat, Leighton. Thank you very much for putting it together. And David, great to talk with you.
The same.
Thanks, guys.